In Quebec in the 1940s, a priest could sign a healthy child into a psychiatric institution without a medical examination. The child had no appeal. The child had no lawyer. The child had no parent to object, because the child was an orphan, a ward of the state, and the state had given the Catholic Church complete authority over its wards. The reclassification was not accidental. It was a financial strategy. In 1940s Quebec, the provincial government paid $1.25 per day to house a child in an orphanage. It paid $2.75 per day to house a patient in a psychiatric institution. The Catholic Church ran both. A healthy child reclassified as mentally ill was worth more than twice as much. Over the following decades, approximately 20,000 children were transferred from Quebec orphanages to psychiatric institutions. They were not mentally ill. They were children without parents who had been assigned a diagnosis by people who stood to profit from it. What happened to them inside those institutions, the physical abuse, the pharmaceutical experimentation, the lobotomies performed on children who had no mental illness that warranted them, constitutes one of the most systematic acts of institutional child abuse in Canadian history. The government of Quebec has acknowledged it. The Catholic Church has not. Nobody has gone to prison. Maurice Duplessis was Premier of Quebec for most of the period between 1936 and 1959. He was known as le chef, the boss. He ran Quebec as a personal fiefdom, with the support of the Catholic Church, which he empowered to an extraordinary degree. Under Duplessis, the Church ran Quebec's schools, hospitals, and social services. It ran the orphanages. It ran the psychiatric institutions. It ran the system through which children without parents were processed, housed, and managed. The financial arrangement between the provincial government and the Church was straightforward. The Church provided the services, the government paid per bed. The 1954 Federal Hospital Insurance and Diagnostic Services Act introduced a specific inequity that the Church immediately identified and exploited. Federal funding was available for patients in recognized psychiatric institutions. It was not available for children in orphanages. The solution the Church implemented, reclassifying orphans as mentally ill and transferring them to institutions that qualified for the higher federal funding rate, was not illegal under the existing framework. There was no law that required a medical examination before a psychiatric commitment. There was no independent oversight of the institutions. There was no mechanism by which a child could challenge the diagnosis applied to them. The system worked exactly as it had been designed. It had simply not been designed with the welfare of children in mind. The children who were transferred from orphanages to psychiatric institutions were, in most cases, given no explanation. They were simply moved. One day they were in a facility they knew, among children they recognized. The next day they were in a locked ward, surrounded by people with genuine severe mental illness, classified as patients rather than orphans. Their new status changed everything about how they were treated. Orphans had certain rights under Quebec law, rights to education, to basic care, to eventual release into adult life. Patients in psychiatric institutions had no such rights. They were not entitled to education. They were not entitled to release. They were entitled to treatment, and treatment, in the institutions of 1950s Quebec, meant pharmaceutical experimentation, electroconvulsive therapy, physical restraint, and labor. The children who were transferred worked in the institutions. They cleaned the wards. They assisted with the care of genuinely ill patients. They were used as a free labor pool inside institutions that were being paid to house them as patients. The educational opportunities they had received as orphans, however limited, disappeared entirely. A generation of Quebec children, many of whom had been on track for eventual normal adult life, were locked into a system that had no exit. They remained patients, classified as mentally ill, for years and in some cases for the rest of their lives. The survivors of the Duplessis orphan system have provided detailed testimony about conditions inside the psychiatric institutions. The accounts are consistent across hundreds of witnesses and span multiple institutions across Quebec. Physical punishment was routine and severe. Children were beaten for minor infractions, speaking out of turn, failing to complete assigned work, attempting to communicate with outsiders. Solitary confinement in dark, unheated rooms was used as a disciplinary measure. Sexual abuse by staff, both clerical and non-clerical, was documented in multiple institutions and described in survivor testimony as systematic rather than exceptional. Medical experimentation was conducted on the children without consent. Pharmaceutical compounds were tested. Surgical procedures were performed. The most disturbing documented practice was the use of lobotomy, a surgical procedure that severs connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, on children who had no mental illness that could have warranted such an intervention. The lobotomies produced permanent neurological damage. The children who received them did not recover. They emerged from the procedure permanently altered, not by mental illness, but by the treatment applied to a mental illness they had never had. These facts are documented. They are documented in survivor testimony, in the limited records that survived the institutional destruction of files, and in the findings of a Quebec government commission established in the 1990s. They are not disputed. They are simply not widely known. The Duplessis orphan system operated from the early 1940s through the early 1960s, when the Quiet Revolution began to dismantle the Church's control over Quebec's social institutions. As the institutions were reformed and eventually transferred to secular management, the files relating to the orphan reclassifications were not preserved. Records were destroyed, lost, or simply not maintained in a form that allowed for later reconstruction. The children who grew up inside the psychiatric institutions emerged, those who were eventually released, into an adult Quebec that did not know what had happened to them. They had no documentation of their childhood. Their birth records frequently identified them as mentally deficient. They had no education. They had no family connections. They had no network of support. They had the stigma of having been in a psychiatric institution attached to them for the rest of their lives. Many did not speak about what had happened to them for decades. The trauma of institutionalized abuse, particularly abuse perpetrated by authority figures in settings that provided no external validation of the victim's experience, produces a specific kind of silence. The victims doubt their own memories. They have been told, repeatedly and by authority, that they were mentally ill, that their perceptions were unreliable, that their accounts of what happened to them were symptoms rather than testimony. It took decades, and the organized advocacy of survivors working together, to break that silence into something the public could hear. In 1989, a group of survivors of the Duplessis orphan institutions formed the Comité d'Orphelins et d'Orphelines Victimes d'Abus, the Committee of Orphan Victims of Abuse. Led by Rod Vino and Bruno Roy, among others, the committee began the work of documenting what had happened, collecting survivor testimony, identifying the institutions involved, locating what documentary evidence had survived, and building the case for public acknowledgement and compensation. The work was not easy. The survivors were elderly. Many had spent their lives carrying the official classification of mentally deficient, a label applied in childhood by the same system they were now trying to hold accountable. Their credibility was challenged. The Catholic Church's response was dismissive. The Quebec government's response was slow. In 1999, the Quebec government formally acknowledged that the reclassification had occurred and offered compensation of $10,000 Canadian to each identified survivor, an amount the survivor community rejected as inadequate. The government subsequently increased the offer to $25,000 per person, plus $10,000 for those who could document specific abuse. The Catholic Church contributed nothing. The Church's position, maintained by both the Quebec Catholic hierarchy and the Vatican, was that it bore no institutional responsibility for what had occurred in institutions it had operated and profited from. This position has not changed. In 1999, following the public acknowledgement of the orphan reclassifications, attention turned to what had happened to those who had died inside the institutions. Survivor testimony described children dying inside psychiatric facilities and being buried in unmarked graves on institutional grounds. An investigation confirmed that the cemetery at the former Saint-Jean-de-Dieu Psychiatric Hospital in Montreal contained the remains of an unknown number of former patients, including children who had been institutionalized as Duplessis orphans. The cemetery had not been maintained as a public burial ground. The graves were unmarked or poorly marked, the records incomplete, the families, where families existed, not notified. A group of survivors and advocates organized to have the graves investigated and the remains identified where possible. The investigation found over 500 bodies in a section of the cemetery that had been used for institutional burials. The identification process was complicated by the destruction of records and by the passage of time. Not all remains could be identified. A memorial was eventually established. The Catholic diocese responsible for the institutions disputed elements of the investigation and resisted full cooperation with the process of identification and commemoration. The memorial exists. The bodies are there. The church that put them there has not apologized. The Catholic Church's response to the Duplessis orphan scandal has been, across more than 3 decades of public reckoning, a study in institutional self-protection. Individual clergy members have expressed personal regret. Some local parish communities have participated in memorial events. But the institutional church, the Quebec diocese, the religious orders that operated the institutions, the Vatican, has not issued a formal apology. It has not accepted financial responsibility. It has not opened its archives fully to investigators. The position the Church has consistently maintained is that the practices of the 1940s and 1950s must be understood in the context of their time, that the Church operated within a framework established by the provincial government, that the clergy who administered the institutions acted in accordance with the standards of their era, and that the Church as an institution cannot be held responsible for the individual actions of its members. This argument collapses under examination. The reclassification was not a spontaneous act by individual clergy. It was a systematic financial strategy implemented across multiple institutions simultaneously. It required coordination. It required institutional decision-making. It required the Church's leadership to know what was happening and to permit it to continue. The records that would establish the chain of decision-making are in the Church's archives. They have not been released. The survivors' requests for access have been denied. The statute of limitations on criminal charges has expired. Nobody will go to prison. The archives remain closed. The most enduring damage of the Duplessis orphan system is not what can be documented and compensated. It is what cannot. A child who spends their formative years in a psychiatric institution rather than in a school does not recover the education they were denied. A child who is labeled mentally deficient at age 8 and who carries that label through adolescence and into adulthood does not easily shed it. A child who is subjected to physical and sexual abuse in an environment that denies the reality of that abuse does not heal simply because the environment eventually acknowledges it. The survivors who came forward in the 1990s were in their 50s and 60s. The damage done to them was decades old. The compensation they received, where they received it, arrived in the last years of their lives. Many had already died. Many of those who survived had spent their adult lives in poverty, in social isolation, and in the particular psychological condition produced by being told, for years, that your own experience of reality is a symptom of illness rather than a reliable account of what was done to you. The Quebec government's 1999 acknowledgement, and the subsequent compensation, were important. They were not sufficient. They were the minimum that accountability required, delivered decades late, to people for whom the minimum was all that remained possible. The Church, which ran the system and profited from it, paid nothing and apologized to no one. That is the record. 20,000 healthy children were labeled mentally ill in Quebec so the Catholic Church could collect more government money. The children who survived grew old fighting to be believed. The Church paid nothing and apologized to no one. The archives that would show who made these decisions remain closed. This is Canadian history. Subscribe for a new story every week, the ones they left out of the textbooks.